Good evening, all. This is the Mad Monarchist, here to spread the politically incorrect truth about the monarchies of the world. And we're going to start with the Empire of Japan in World War II. This will be part one of probably a three-part series, because everybody blames Japan for starting World War II in the Far East Pacific area. And we want to get to the truth about this. Have to look at the Japanese pattern of behavior first. Look at the pattern of behavior and ask yourself, is this the country we've learned about, that the way we've seen it portrayed in the popular perception around the world? So to look at the pattern of behavior, we have to go back a ways. We have to go back to World War I and the end of World War I, when Russia was in civil war, the Bolsheviks were taking over, communism was spreading, the Allied nations, and Japan was one of the allies in World War I, they all sent expeditionary forces to Russia. And several sent expeditionary forces to the Far East, the Russian Far East, Siberia, and the country that sent the most troops was Japan. By far the largest number of Allied troops in the Russian Far East were Japanese. And many people may not be aware, but Japanese forces actually occupied huge parts of the Russian Far East at that time. In fact, Japanese forces got as far west as Lake Baikal. And they won several victories over the Bolsheviks. They defeated the Bolsheviks who were attacking them in these areas, and were supporting the anti-communist, pro-monarchist white Russian forces the whole time. And what did Japan do? After they occupied all this territory, won all these victories, what did they do? They left. Packed up and went home. Once the war was over, everything was decided. It was clear the Bolsheviks were going to win. They still supported the white Russian forces in exile, but they didn't annex any territory. They didn't try to hold on to any of this vast part of the Russian Far East that they occupied, completely under their military control. They gave it all back to Russia. Even the northern half of Sakhalin Island, which they'd occupied, which had been in contention between Japan and Russia for some time, Japan gave it back, even though they were in no way compelled to do so. Doesn't really fit the pattern of behavior of an aggressive power out to grab territory wherever possible, does it? There were absolutely no annexations, and the primary German colony in China, which was Tsingtao, was taken by Japan in a long siege during World War I. The Japanese didn't keep it, they gave it back to China. They kept some of the other German colonies, which really weren't worth very much, that they captured, that were assigned to them by the peace treaty at Versailles. But they didn't keep Tsingtao, they gave it back to China. So this doesn't really fit the pattern of behavior of an aggressive, conquering nation trying to gather all the territory it possibly can. But then, of course, we come to, and this is what we're going to be focusing on this time, is Manchuria and the September 18th incident. Well, the September 18th incident is very controversial. Well, it might not be very controversial, but it should be, because the facts are very far from being clear-cut. The basic story that has been popularly accepted is that Japanese officers of the Kwantung Army detonated some bombs on the South Manchuria Railway, blamed the incident on China, that this was all a pretext. They blamed it on Chinese bandits, and then occupied all of Manchuria in a swift campaign. Now, even if that was true, no historian, no serious historian even suggests that Tokyo had anything to do with it. They had absolutely no knowledge. Threw the government into a turmoil when this happened. So whether you say the Chinese did it which even the Lytton Commission reported, or if you say the Japanese army, the Kwantung army did it, either way, it was not official policy from the government in Tokyo. And you also have to ask yourself, why would Japanese officers of the Kwantung army that was stationed there, why would they take a risk like that? Because what most people don't know is that there was a large Chinese controlled, it was supposed to be under the control of China anyway. There was the local warlord, you couldn't tell, China was very fractured at the time. But he was officially loyal to the Republic of China, the government of Chiang Kai-shek, who had a far larger army than the Japanese had, who had modern tanks, artillery. In every way, the Japanese were outmatched. And so you have to ask yourself, if they were just going off to purposely provoke a war, why would they want to purposely provoke a war where you have right next door to you here an army vastly larger and better equipped than your own? They took no action, but of course the Japanese couldn't have had any guarantee that that would have happened. Pretty big risk to take. But the most important thing, which is always overlooked, is, does the September 18th incident, the Mukden incident, does it even matter? Why should that even matter? It shouldn't, because the fact of the matter is that the Republic of China had absolutely no right to Manchuria. Now, why was that? Why was that? The Republic of China was still a relatively young country at that time. It was only 1911, 1912 they'd overthrown the Qing dynasty. Where did the Qing dynasty come from? They came from Manchuria. They'd been ruling in Manchuria before they came and ruled over China. They were an independent power, starting with Emperor Nahachi. And it was later his son and then his son that consolidated Manchu rule over China. First over Mongolia, then over China. Now when China, the Han Chinese rose up, forced the last Qing Emperor Xuantong to abdicate, because the Empress Dowager abdicated on his behalf, of course, because he was a child. What gave them the right to say we claim Mongolia and Manchuria? And they claimed both of them. They even sent troops into outer Mongolia, and they were only driven out in 1921 by the White Russian forces of Baron von Ungern-Sternberg. Later they were in turn driven out by pro-Soviet forces, and Mongolia became the first Soviet satellite state. Manchuria became ruled by warlords nominally loyal to the Republican government. But just because the Manchu emperor was no longer wanted in China, how did that translate to China suddenly gaining a right to rule Manchuria? It's absurd. It would be just as absurd as after the American War for Independence, the United States saying, well, now we claim the islands of Great Britain and Ireland as part of the United States because we were both in the British Empire together. Now, obviously, anyone would look at that and say that's absurd. Well, the same circumstances apply to China and Manchuria. Just because the emperor was no longer emperor of China didn't mean he was no longer emperor of Manchuria. And even if you say, well, okay, but still he's an emperor, so what? That doesn't mean the people wanted to be separate. Maybe the people wanted to be part of China. Well, that'd be a pretty hard case to make because no one ever asked them. They never had a vote on it. They never had a vote on getting rid of the Qing dynasty in China itself. They never put this stuff to a popular vote. Nobody did that. And certainly nobody asked the Manchurians what they thought about it. The Manchurians had no part in the revolution against the Qing dynasty. And why should they have? They were kind of sort of a privileged class. It was their people who the ruling emperor and the ruling dynasty was from. It was one of their people. In fact, Manchuria was sort of a special preserve of the Manchu nobility during most of the Qing Dynasty reign. During most of the Qing Dynasty reign, Han Chinese weren't even permitted to go there. That was their special territory reserved for the Manchu people. And suddenly the Chinese come up, they overthrow the Qing emperor, and then they want to claim, no, we also own Manchuria too. The fact is they had no right to it. They had no right to say anything about Japan occupying Manchuria. And all those forces they had there, they didn't resist the Japanese either. Because a lot of them were Manchurians too, who weren't really happy with the political situation in China. So if China had no right to Manchuria, it was absolutely none of their business what Japan did there. And what did Japan finally do? Japan brought back the legitimate emperor. The last Qing emperor, everyone knows, Puyi, made him first head of state, then emperor of Manchuria again, which was his hereditary right. It was the land, the country his family had ruled for hundreds of years, long before they ruled China. It was his ancestral homeland. When Japan occupied Manchuria, restored the last Qing emperor, they were righting a historical wrong. They were correcting a gross historical injustice. And China didn't resist. They tried to resist a little bit at the end, but by then, too little too late. They were more concerned at the time with fighting the communists, because again, China was very fractured, which was one thing Japan was concerned about, and legitimately concerned about. You have an expanding Soviet Union to your north, northwest. Right to the west, you have a very large, very fractured, very violent China, with all these civil wars going on all the time. Japan had every right to be concerned about that. And again, they didn't annex Manchuria. They set up an empire of Manchuria. So, it's important to keep that in mind. It certainly doesn't fit the bill with what most people have heard and what most people assume about Japan and the build-up to World War II. Because some people say World War II started then. And usually the people saying that are saying that on the basis that, well, Japan had just invaded China. Japan didn't invade China in 1931 because of the September 18th incident. Japan occupied Manchuria, which China had no right to in the first place. Set up the Empire of Manchuria under the legitimate hereditary ruler of the Manchurian people. They didn't annex any territory. Later on, the war did spread to China, and we will be talking about that next time. Until then, stay mad, my friends. Part 2, focusing on the invasion of China. And if you read most history books, the general opinion is that the Japanese invasion of China can be traced back to the Marco Polo bridge incident of July 1937. And if you read serious historians and stay away from the bias stuff, stay away from what comes from radically partisan points of view, most will say the issue was not clear-cut as to who was responsible for the Marco Polo bridge incident. In fact, some suggest that it was probably inevitable that it happened just because you had two hostile armies in such close proximity. You say, well, why were they there? Everybody had troops in China. It wasn't just Japan. America, European countries, all had troops in China and had been keeping troops in China since the Boxer Rebellion, some further back than that in their various concessions. And I'm sure most people know the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the basic facts there, what happened. There was some night exercises being carried out by the Japanese Imperial Army. A soldier went missing. There was some confusion. Fighting broke out. The two sides stopped. Fighting broke out again. And eventually more and more forces were pulled into it until hostilities broke out. And the war didn't start completely right there, but it was a triggering incident. Other incidents happened building up until what happened resulted in basically a full-scale war, even though it's important to note neither side declared war on the other. When you read it now, and China's saying Japan invaded China, and Japan was being aggressive, and Japan was attacking us, but they never declared war on Japan. Kind of interesting. But there's some important things to keep in mind about the Marco Polo Bridge incident and assigning blame. One important thing to remember that many people are unaware of is that many of the Chinese generals and Japanese generals were on very good terms. Some of them were pretty good friends. And when fighting broke out, they would arrange a truce, and when fighting would break out again, they were shocked and horrified. Many of them were. Now, of course, on both sides, there were other people in the militaries and in the governments who were more strident, who were more aggressive. But the people on the ground, if you read what was said by the people there, by the commanders on the ground, they were trying to minimize this, trying to contain it. It's also important to remember, 2 times during the course of this, because it happened over several days, these events happened. There was a truce arranged, at least twice a truce was arranged, and both times it was broken. Now, arguments over who broke it, but Japanese troops were killed. Tends to suggest the Japanese were not the ones doing this. It's also important to remember in how they were trying to defuse this situation that Japan wanted a drawdown. Step back, cool off. But the Chinese sent in more troops. A great many troops, in fact. They sent in 4 divisions, or 4 or 5 divisions. They had more troops there than Japan did. So, whoever started it, China was certainly escalating it. But of course the point is, who started it? That's the key point. That's what everyone wants to talk about, and everyone wants to assign blame. And as I said before, usually it's blame Japan. So they point to the occupation of Manchuria and say, well, see there, they were already being aggressive. We discussed that last time. Manchuria should have been independent already. The Republic of China had absolutely no right to Manchuria. Like I said last time, no different than if the United States of America claimed to own Great Britain and Ireland because they've both been in the British Empire when the United States became independent. It's absurd. Now, there are some Japanese historians who will say that what happened at the Marco Polo Bridge was arranged, set up by members of the Chinese Communist Party, purposely to provoke a war between Japan and the nationalist faction in the Republic of China. Not everybody's going to believe that, of course, because these are Japanese historians. Some of them are on the radical fringe and say, well, they're biased. They're not. Of course they're going to say that, right? Of course they're going to say that. They're going to say it wasn't us, it was the other guy. Shouldn't believe them. And some of the people who repeat that, yeah, they're not very credible sources. I'll be the first to admit it. They're not the most credible sources. Some of this comes from very racist camps of people who say, oh, we never did anything wrong. Our people never did anything wrong. Everybody else did. The Chinese did, and the Americans, the Europeans, the white people were all evil, but we never did anything wrong. But the thing is, they're not the only ones saying that. They might go farther. But again, even in Japan, most historians say probably wasn't that clear cut. And there are also those who have studied it, studied the history, everything, the people who were there at the time, done serious research about this, and said, you know what? Wasn't Japan's fault. They didn't start it. China started it. And if you don't want to believe them, if you think, well, the Japanese, they're biased. Okay, well, don't listen to the Japanese. Listen to someone like John Toland, who wrote a book called The Rising Sun. He said China started it. Who was John Toland? John Toland is an American. Not somebody you would expect to be taking the side of Japan in the lead up to World War II. And also another historian, a Yale historian, James B. Crowley, also an American, who said China escalated it. It didn't have to be that big a deal, but China escalated it. Now, as to the communist plot, the idea of it being a communist plot. Now, that, I'm sure to some people, that sounds like a wild conspiracy theory. What we're dealing with, as I said at the outset, we're dealing here with the truth. What happened? Can't state as fact something that is just a theory. And if it's a conspiracy theory, you're getting on really shaky ground. But there is something to this. Because something that happened later, this was in July 1937, August 37. A Japanese officer was murdered in Shanghai. This was Lieutenant Oyama Isao, who was murdered, and this set off another round of hostilities between the Chinese and the Japanese forces around Shanghai. That was a communist plot. How do we know that was a communist plot? It's not the Japanese who are saying that. It's the Chinese who are saying that. In fact, it was the dictator of China, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, who said that one of his agents was a general in the Chinese forces at Shanghai, and that they had set up the murder of Lieutenant Oyama Isao. This was after the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Chairman Mao admitted this. In fact, he bragged about it. He boasted about it. Yeah, we did that. Now, if he was capable of doing that then, it doesn't seem that far-fetched that maybe he would have done something similar earlier. In fact, maybe things didn't, because war didn't just break out immediately, full-blown war didn't break out immediately. Maybe that, at the Marco Polo Bridge incident, maybe that's why they said we need to try something else. We need to fire up another spark somewhere else. How about Shanghai? We got a guy down there. We'll murder a Japanese officer. Get the two sides to fighting. And Chairman Mao said, when he bragged about this and he boasted about this, the reason why he wanted to do it was because he wanted Japan and the nationalists to go to war. Because they would kill each other, they would wear each other down, and ultimately, no matter who won, they would be worn out by the conflict, and then he and his communists could come emerging from their rural hideouts, knock over the winner with a little difficulty, and then he would be ruling China. Which doesn't seem quite so strange when you consider that's basically exactly what happened. The way history worked out. The way history worked out was what? The Second Sino-Japanese War starts. Again, even though China never declared war on Japan, the war starts. It's the nationalist faction who are doing the fighting. The communists, for a while there, they said, okay, we're going to have a ceasefire and have a show of unity between the communists and the nationalists. It was a show and nothing more. The communist Chinese did practically nothing, made practically no contribution to World War II, to the war against Japan. They were restricted to basically low-level harassment activities. It was the nationalist troops who did all the fighting. It was the Chinese nationalist troops who fought Japan all the way. And in the end, what happened? Japan was defeated after other countries declared war on Japan. Japan was defeated, pulled their troops out. Chairman Mao comes out of hiding with all his communists. They defeat the nationalists, takes over China. So everything worked out just the way he planned it. And that makes it seem a little bit more plausible, I would think, that maybe they were behind the Marco Polo Bridge incident. You can't state that as a fact. You can't state it for a fact that they were behind the murder of Oyama Isao in Shanghai, because Chairman Mao admitted it. Chairman Mao boasted about it. And if they were capable of doing it there, who's to say they wouldn't be capable of doing it in Peking? But of course, this was how the war, the undeclared war with China, started. An undeclared war between two countries, that's hardly a world war. But it was what occupied Japan's attention. Japan's trying to end this war. They were not looking to expand it, certainly. But it did expand, and that's how it turned into a world war. And that's what we're going to be talking about next time, and what may be the more lengthy and most controversial part of this little series. Until next time, stay mad, my friends. Part 3. We talked about before the Mukden incident, the China incident, but of course that all involved fighting China. Japan and China fighting each other, the Second Sino-Japanese War. That's not a world war. It didn't become a world war until the attack on Pearl Harbor, when Britain, the United States, the Netherlands all declared war against Japan. Japan declared war against them. How did that start? First thing to keep in mind is that Japan was heavily involved in the war with China, had made no aggressive moves against the United States, or the British, or the Dutch, or anyone else. But for some reason, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, started to feign more and more concern about what Japan was doing. They started talking about Japanese aggression. And what were the reasons for the U.S. concern? Because the war in China had been going on for 10 years. We already talked about how it all started. Japan was not at fault for that, but Japan was involved, and Japan had been fighting in China for 10 years, made no move against the USA, and the USA had taken no action. All of a sudden, the U.S. starts to take action, starts to intervene. What were the reasons? Well, the primary reason given was a completely baseless one. The only thing they could point to of Japan acting outside of China, and as we talked about before, China never declared war on Japan during any of this time, 10 years of fighting. The only other involvement outside of China involved the occupation of Indochina, with some portraying this as a Japanese invasion of Indochina. Well, of course it wasn't that. That was completely untrue. Japan didn't invade Indochina. At the time it was French Indochina. That's today Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Japan occupied a few bases in Vietnam, French Indochina, with the permission of the French government. And the French government at that time, I know someone will surely point out, was the Vichy regime. Of course, what they usually don't add is that the Vichy regime was recognized at that time by the United States as the legitimate government of France. They allowed Japan to come in and use their bases because they were trying to stop the flow of supplies going to the Chinese Republican forces. That was the American-recognized legitimate government of France, according to the United States. The United States continued to recognize the Vichy regime up until the Allied invasions of French territory, after the U.S. got into World War II. So that concern was completely baseless. But FDR was wanting to get involved. He was clearly wanting to get involved. But he promised the American people that he would not send their sons to fight in any foreign wars. But interestingly enough, he later added a little amendment to that by saying that if someone attacked the United States, then it would not be a foreign war. And we can see from the McCollum memo from October 1940, which was all about provoking Japan into attacking the United States, provoking Japan into war. And we can see also by, not just that, that's documented evidence, we also have testimony of many other people in the highest echelons of power in Washington, D.C., saying the same thing, that FDR intended to provoke Japan into war. Because he told his people, I don't want to fight any foreign wars, I'm not going to get us involved in any foreign wars. But he wanted to get involved, but because he'd said that promise, he had to get somebody else to strike the first blow. Now, he tried to get Germany to strike the first blow. He did everything he could to provoke Germany. But of course, they didn't take the bait. American naval vessels were actually attacking German military ships, submarines in the Atlantic before the U.S. had got into World War II. But Hitler wouldn't fight back, wouldn't take the bait. And there really wasn't anything the U.S. could do to make him. There was no pressure they could put on Germany. There was really no pressure. Germany was under as much pressure as you could get by that point. But Japan was a different story. They could put pressure on Japan because Japan is an island nation, and it depends on imports, imported raw materials, resources for their survival. And so the United States, FDR administration, says, well, we're going to put an embargo on Japan. We're going to send them an ultimatum, say, unless you withdraw from China and Manchuria, which China had no right to, as we covered in Part 1, we're not going to allow you to have any more steel, any more of these resources, and most importantly, oil, unless you do that. Now, what country in the world would go along with that? Do you think the United States, if the United States was fighting a war somewhere and there was some vital resource that the United States needed, and another country said, we're going to deprive you of that resource unless you do what we want, do you think the United States would just submit to that? Would any country submit to that? Of course they wouldn't. And Roosevelt knew Japan wouldn't either, because that would be completely surrendering your independence. You'd be allowing a foreign country to dictate your national defense and your foreign policy. He knew Japan would never agree to that. But it was a pressure he could put on Japan. And not a lot of people realize by December 1941, the Empire of Japan had only 18 months of oil left. So they had to do something. And that's where the plan to attack Pearl Harbor started to come about. They said the only place we can get oil is Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies. And if we just go down there and take it, it's going to mean war. So we're going to end up fighting Britain and America one way or the other. The only way we're going to have a chance against America is if we can wipe out the Pacific Fleet in one blow. That's how the attack on Pearl Harbor came about. That's where the idea came from. But Roosevelt wasn't just going to wait for that either. Everyone knows about the attack on Pearl Harbor. What they don't know is that at least 5 months before Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan, Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the bombing of Japan. And this is not a conspiracy theory. This is fact. This is documented fact. The order was called JB 355. And this was classified for many years. It was only declassified very quietly in the 1970s. I didn't hear about it until the 1990s, when it was reported in the news. But still today, you won't see this talked about. I've never seen it in any history book, any textbook in the United States. I doubt many people in Japan know about it. But 5 months before Pearl Harbor was attacked, FDR signed off on the order JB 355, which called for the firebombing of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagasaki by American forces. Now, because of his promise to the people of the United States, to the American voters, they were going to be flying legally under the jurisdiction of the Republic of China. And just to reiterate, because again, not a lot of people know about this. It's been reported, but not many people know about it. It's documented fact. They had the order with Roosevelt's signature right on it. Many of you will have probably seen the film, Japanese-American co-production, called Tora Tora Tora, about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And you remember when the Japanese planes were coming in, and the radar station reports that they see all these planes coming in, and the officer in charge says, don't worry about it. Because they were expecting a flight of B-17 heavy bombers to be coming in from the mainland, and they assumed it was them. And you will also remember, if you've seen the film, a very dramatic scene during the attack. These bombers come in. And one of them says something about, what a way to enter a war. We're unarmed and we're out of gas. And they crash land and everything. How many of you asked yourself why those B-17 bombers were coming to Hawaii in the first place? The B-17 is a heavy bomber. That's an offensive weapon. It's not a defensive weapon. And it really wouldn't be of any use in Hawaii. Well, it's because they were going on to the Philippines. Why were they going to the Philippines? Well, who in the neighborhood of the Philippines would the United States want to attack? Because that's all you can do with heavy bombers. You can't defend yourself with bombers. You can defend yourself with fighters, but not with bombers. The only thing you can do with bombers is attack somebody. Well, those were the bombers, the B-17 heavy bombers that were going ultimately to China to carry out the firebombing of Japan. They were to be attached to the Flying Tigers, which was an American mercenary group, very famous group of fighter pilots that were fighting for the nationalist faction in China against the Japanese, and were being paid under the table, as veterans of the Flying Tigers themselves admitted many years later, by the United States government, which was illegal. It was in contravention to the American neutrality laws, which Congress had passed specifically to keep the United States out of World War II. That's where they were going. That was the plan. It was only because Japan moved faster than the United States did in getting those bombers over there, getting them over to China. Of course, they never made it to China because they got taken out during the attack on Pearl Harbor. But they were on their way to attack Japan. And FDR, again, to reiterate, this is not conjecture, this is not conspiracy theory, this is documented fact. They had the order, it's been declassified, it's got Roosevelt's signature on it. 5 months before Pearl Harbor, he ordered American planes and American pilots, just with a Chinese flag slapped on the side, to bomb Japan, which had not attacked the United States and had made no aggressive move against the United States. And so with these facts, it's pretty clear. If you look at the declaration of war that was issued by Japan, by His Majesty the Emperor, read it for yourself. You can find it online. Read it for yourself. Everything that is said in that declaration of war is completely true. It talks about the United States cutting off vital resources that Japan needs to survive. Not just to fight a war, but just to survive. That's true. It talks about American military buildup in the Far East. Also true. They have these things they call pop-up cruises, of these ships going along and closer into Japanese waters. Roosevelt ordered that, all part of his provocative moves against Japan. Try to keep them off balance, try to keep them worried. Now, if you look at the address President Roosevelt gave to Congress, calling for the declaration of war on December 8th, almost everything he says is completely untrue. He calls it an unprovoked and dastardly attack. Well, it wasn't a dastardly attack. Roosevelt himself knew they were coming. Many historians have attributed that. Many people at the time knew that. The United States was reading every cable that came into the Japanese embassy. It was only because of clerical slowness that the declaration of war was not delivered before the attack as it was supposed to have been. But the Roosevelt administration knew it. They knew it before the Japanese ambassador did. And of course, the most laughable part is that it was an unprovoked attack. An unprovoked attack when Roosevelt was depriving Japan of the resources they desperately needed. They couldn't survive without. And saying, we're going to deprive you of what you need unless you do what we say. Unless you follow orders from us. And says it was unprovoked. And while he had, 5 months earlier, before Japan had done anything to the United States, signed an order calling for the bombing of Japanese cities. And he calls it an unprovoked attack. Again, these are very simple facts. It's not conjecture. It's not reading the tea leaves. It's not conspiracy theory. Documented fact. It's in the archives. It's been declassified. You can see the order, JB 355, with Roosevelt's signature on it, ordering the bombing of Japan. You can talk. We have that testimony of people in the administration, of people in the military, of the guys who were in China, the Flying Tigers, who were fighting for the Chinese against Japan before the war started. All confirm it. These are the facts. So it's safe to say that when it comes to spreading the war wider, World War II, when the Second Sino-Japanese War became World War II in East Asia and the Pacific area, was Japan at fault? Clearly not. Japan didn't want a war with the United States, or Great Britain, or the Dutch, or anyone else for that matter. They were fighting China. The U.S. decided to intervene. Of course, Britain backed them up because Britain wanted American help in fighting the Germans. They were getting clobbered. They were getting bombed. Their forces in Egypt were hard-pressed. They needed American help. So, of course, they were going to go along. And that's the sad part. Because President Roosevelt could have went to the American people. He could have been honest. He could have went to the American people and said, look, Hitler and the Germans, they've invaded all these countries. They've invaded Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, France, Yugoslavia, Greece. He's a menace to world peace, and I think it is our duty to help Britain and the Allies to fight the Germans in Europe. He could have made that case to the American people. If he was honest, he could have made that case to the American people. But he didn't. Instead, he provoked a war with Japan, which had done nothing to anyone, hadn't invaded any other countries. Troops were already in China. They've been fighting China for 10 years without anybody saying anything. In fact, in the past, the Germans had been supporting the nationalist Chinese. But Japan was the only country Roosevelt could exert pressure on. So that's what he did. He exerted all the pressure peacefully that he could, with the embargo, freezing assets, barring Japanese ships from the Panama Canal, did all this stuff, even though Japan had done nothing to the United States, had not invaded any other countries, was fighting a war they'd been fighting for most of a decade, and even that was a war they didn't start. And then when he was concerned that wouldn't be enough, he signs the order to say, go ahead and bomb Japan. Just make sure that there's a Republic of China flag painted on the side of the airplane, an American bomber flown by an American pilot, but with a Chinese flag on the side, so I can tell the people, oh, well, it was China that bombed Japan, see. And then, obviously, Japan would have counterattacked, as any country would. Japan would fight back, and then he could say, well, see, now they're attacking us, unprovoked again. He lied about it. In reality, he would have just as easily lied about that. So we have the facts, we have the evidence. It's not very well known, and it's scandalous that it's not very well known, because there is no doubt. We have the testimony of the people involved, who were not at all embarrassed about it. They were quite proud of the fact. Many years later, they talked to him, they've interviewed him. They have the documents, they have the orders, signed by Roosevelt. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not an unprovoked attack. President Roosevelt intended for that to happen. Maybe not specifically the way it worked out, but he intended to do everything in his power to force Japan to strike the first blow so he could go to the American people and say, we were the victim. That's exactly what he did. He got exactly what he wanted, a world war. The United States involved in it. Didn't need to happen that way. But as one member of Congress said, President Roosevelt lied us into war because he lacked the courage to lead us into war. And that's the truth. And that is the politically incorrect truth about Japan in World War II. Hope you've enjoyed this little series, and I hope you've learned something from it. There will be more to come. Until next time, stay mad, my friends.